Blessed love and peace in Rastafari. This is an addendum to the Cinco-hour soliloquy marathon just from a few hours ago about the vulnerabilities of celibacy within the Republic imperialist way, system, structure, construct, dissolution. So, two main thoughts of the moment. One is that the Republic, the nature of imperialism, the method of imperialism, the phenomena of imperialism is, tenacious. It's advanced. There's no outthinking it. A man is not going to outthink the imperialist construct. It's not going to happen. Not going to out strategize it. Not going to outpower it. It's just a matter of patience, discipline, and distancing, and observing the imperialist construct deteriorate, self-destruct. That's the nature of it. There's no overpowering it, particularly at this point. So the point for that is, when we look at the paradigms of empire before the rise and fall of civilizations. I mentioned before the barbarians existing outside the territorial boundaries, being independent from the infrastructure of the empire, and getting stronger and stronger whilst the empire gets weaker and weaker, and then eventually invading when there is that opportunity. That is absent at this moment in the world imperialist system, significantly facilitated through the World Republic, because there's no outer boundaries. Technically, I describe the non-contact, the no-contact natives being the barbarians, but not even endeavoring or having the ambition of conquest. But the empire is so strong in the cognitive, and so vulnerable in the cognitive, that it's unnecessary for the no-contact native to conquer physically, intentionally, directly the world imperialist. It's simply a matter of the no-contact native being disciplined and nature manifesting that will of balance in deteriorating the contemporary experience construct of imperialism. So that's that part of it. Now there's another part of it, the prophet. It's necessary for those with the prophetic inclination to live off the grid. Jesus lives off the grid. The Buddha lives off the grid. Moshe Rabbeinu lives off the grid. Abraham Avinu lives off the grid. The whole lifestyle of the shepherd, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, lives off the grid. The prophetic trodder lives off the grid, lives independent autonomous from the infrastructure, the hierarchies, the leverages, the influence, the temptation, the threats of the empire, of the imperialism. Off grid. Again, so today, that physicality, and so it's in the physical sense. Moshe Rabbeinu leaves Mitzrayim and goes to Midian to escape persecution, prosecution. Jesus is continually looking for the lonely place, living in people's houses, whoever accepts him. Abraham Avinu becomes a shepherd, leaves the land of the Chaldees, and goes eventually to Canaan, wandering, being a shepherd from land to land. Continual diplomacy with the kings of each of the lands. The Buddha. In India, there is the tradition of those who live off grid. It's again, India is that vortex that, what's going on? But it absorbs everything. It absorbs everything, and the nature of imperialism in India doesn't get much beyond India. It detaches itself for those who visit and leave India, the British Empire particularly, Islam particularly, but India in itself as a construct. Anyways, that's a whole phenomenon. But the point is, with the Buddha, India already has that involved in the fabric of society. The tradition of the sadhu, those who go off from the household state and walk the spiritual path, and are supported by the community accordingly, recognized and supported by the community accordingly. So that's off grid. All that's off grid. So anybody who has an interest of like activism or whatever, you need to live off grid. Otherwise, shut the fuck up. The sparrow's like, that's what's happening. Serious. So that's the thing. The sparrows are holding it down with the rice again. Off grid. Now the challenge at the moment for those with the prophetic inclination is that each of those scenarios, with the exception of the Buddha, well, I guess Jesus to a certain extent as well, physically live off grid, move out of the area. And that is less plausible today, again, because not only is all the world drawn and all the world claimed by one entity, or actually a multitude of entities, but there's technology, surveillance of enforcing those rules, and it's not the omniscient eye, but it is rather severe in enforcing those lines. So that physical separation from imperialism is comparatively tenuous. Even in the United States, living in a national park, and additionally avails itself to particular specific types of persecution, incarceration, put in a psych ward, in beyond even just simply being able to live in the elements, and then also all the predatoriness, murderers, rapists, cannibalists, all that serious militias, lots of dangers outside of the city, serious. So and then in being able to fend that off, I mean, we're talking about survivalists who know how to track kinfolk down and can tell who it ain't hiding from those kinfolk because they got skills. Many actually are employed by the government as park rangers, and additionally, look at case studies of mass murderers, and additionally, in the vast wildernesses in the middle and western parts of this continent. So lots of travails that exist within the wilderness that exists outside of the actual cities, and even then, it's still surveillanced by the imperialist system. There's no physical refuge. In the traditional historic sense, as we evidenced before. So it becomes a matter of distancing whilst exactly being in the midst of the imperialist system. That means being without money. Well, all right. Trying to remember the second thing I'm supposed to be sharing. Oh, okay, so sorry, I'm remembering the first thing. It might have been the second thing, but right now we're just going to go with this right now. So with the celibacy, for the prophetic path involves celibacy in marriage. Well, it involves celibacy until marriage. Now, my point for talking about the world system and the evolution of the world of the imperialism, even through the guise of the republic, is that it's very knowledgeable about all these methodologies, about all the different ways in which prophetic voices, prophetic kinfolk, ancestors, prophets, and sages of the past undo the previous constructs of imperialism and endeavor to thwart those. Now, there's only so much that the imperialist system can do, but it does have a significant knowledge and has a lot of means of imposing threats and temptation. Outright violence and other things is a super speed path towards the self-destruction of the empire, and the empire knows that. Doesn't necessarily mean it's not prone to do that, but still, um, it's a fast forward button towards self destruction. Uh, so there's the nuances and the overtures and the increased applied pressures and stuff like that, temptations, distractions, and additionally. So that's what I'm getting to in terms of practicing celibacy, because when the prophetically inclined kinfolk um, go off grid and live increasingly independent and autonomous from the imperialist system, there is continuing, ongoing susceptibility, vulnerability to the ways of the imperialist system. And it's not a matter of like agents coming around, it's a matter of like how life is, how the regular norms of society. All right, so the point here, I'll get to the point. The point is that celibacy, when a man is practicing celibacy, particularly in a spiritual sense, and distant from the society, the mainstream status quo, conventional methods and system. Particularly at the moment in the Republic, in the binary of celibacy and hedonistic sex, the practice of celibacy is manipulated by the authoritarian construct to cause increasing isolation from cooperation with other entities within society. This might sound again like victimization, self-pitying, or whatever else. I'm simply communicating the conditions. When a man practices that spiritual discipline, and particularly celibacy, even just being in a cave, just like again with Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Jesus going out to the wilderness, Jesus looking for a lonely place, that same methodology and solution of getting distance. In the historic methodology, even Lao Tzu, Kongsu, going from province to province, getting a large pickup truck flying a large bombs bursting in air flag. So in those scenarios, the historic scenarios, when one goes off grid, Moshe Rabbeinu goes off grid, he's able to attach himself to others who are not part of that imperialist construct, and he is able to secure social relationship, marriage, economic provisions, livelihood, and accordingly through those contracts, through that negotiation and treaty, essentially. The life of the shepherd and further is increasingly self-sustaining economically. It requires diplomacy, holding one's own in terms of politics, and additionally, but there's increasing self-sufficiency. When one endeavors to go off grid, when one does go off grid within the world system, there's still the necessity of economics, of supporting oneself, shelter, food, clothing, the basics. And that requires interaction with others, one way or the other, because individuals are specialized and thus dependent upon the workings of the city, the workings of the imperial system, in order to attain things that one obtains from providing for oneself. So that becomes precarious when that endeavor of living in a cave and being self-sufficient is increasingly precarious when staying in the city, because essentially what happens is that an individual simply becomes further isolated from the allegiances around oneself, and thus, however the individual is getting food methodically, I describe it like this: the spiritual discipline and trod of separating oneself from society, from the imperialist ways, has a vulnerability of isolation, de facto as well as de jure. Sparrows are at each other today. It's the youngsters um, competing over piles. Like, ain't no one sparrow gonna eat this whole thing, and yet they're chopping at each other. It's the youngsters, kind of like getting their pecking order. Interesting. It's also male. It's maybe brother and sister. It's a male and a female. Anyway, all right. So that's the point. It's like in the spiritual discipline, it's rather implausible to find a refuge outside of the imperialist structure, and when endeavoring refuge within and off-grid livelihood within the imperialist structure, that spiritual discipline has the susceptibility to, or the vulnerability to isolationism, because everybody has their own hustle within the imperialist system, even when it's very transparent and like venturing to be collaborative, and additionally, it's still, because each one has their hand in the world system, still leveraged and still vulnerable to the reactions within the system. So that's economically, lightweight politically, but particularly economically. And then also pertaining to marriage and relationship between a man and a woman in marriage. So in that specific context, in that specific experience of a man being on spiritual path, practicing celibacy, being disciplined, that experience of isolationism is increasingly tenuous, because the man may live in a cave within the city, within the imperialist construct, even the suburbs, or even a rural area, and may stay away from society for long periods on end. In staying away, the communication and relationship with others is avails itself to compromise. So that's one liability. In addition to that, there is the eventuality of him having to deal directly with the imperialist construct, whether it's just walking on the street or whatever. So, and the imperialist system is aware of that, and so is very happy to appease a prophetic individual, and even provide rations, sustenance, pacification in that process. And in that arrangement, the practitioner, when eventually at some point interacting with the world imperialist system, by walking on the streets, going to the store, just being in public, avails oneself to the temptations and influence and threats that exist in that environment. That the vast majority of people within the city, within the imperialist construct, suburbia, rural areas, and additionally, counter those threats and temptations through established allegiances and numbers and organizing. So that's part of that is a main coping mechanism in living within civilization, within the world imperialist system, being aligned with others. And so the individual, um, prophetic, it's not an individual, but the prophetic um, kinfolk, and that's the innate tendency of the individual and relation binary. But the prophetically inclined is increasingly susceptible to the isolationist tactics, and as those isolationist tactics apply to the experience of relationship, of marital relationship. Um, okay, just plain spoken, point blank. When a man is walking a righteous path and is practicing celibacy within the world system, again, as I said, he acquires increasing power, energy, but at the same time, he also acquires increasing vulnerability in being influenced by the sexual powers, the seduction of women. The world imperialist system is aware of this. And so when a man is in that path, temptations are provided. There is a young lady, a young girl sparrow who's opening her mouth and expecting to be fed, and there's an older female sparrow who's actually feeding her rice. She knows how to fly, but she's not feeding herself. It's almost like intentional right in front of me, responding to what I've articulated recently as well. So sometimes nature seems like the Matrix. And always the Matrix is simply nature. Solace and balance. Wonder whether the sparrow that's doing the feeding is the big sister or actually the mother. They're about the same size. And it's continual, like the rice is right there. It's like so obvious that it's ridiculous. It's like the mechanics aren't the hard eating rice. The sparrow doesn't seem to. I'll just say the sparrow seems to have, fine health, able to fly and everything else like that. So, anyway, all right. So, the man practices to be prone to distraction. Wow, we're getting into a half hour now. And also, the storage here is very low. Again, reminder to myself. Okay, so there's a second part to this that I'm supposed to share to give further explanation about how this tactic is practiced. So the basic gist of it is that when a man is practicing celibacy and distancing himself from the world imperialist system, in superpowers and yet super vulnerabilities, being distracted by the sexual attraction of women, the world imperialist system utilizing that vulnerability to further throw the prophetically inclined kinfolk off path, sidetracking from priorities, and additionally rationalizing the chasing of women in further. So that's one methodology. The other methodology is when he doesn't do that, when he's not chasing women, when he's not experiencing that female energy, that company, then it's being inundated with toxic masculinity. Um, the Rainbow War Cloud Corporation, men who are of many different types, but particularly men who are very congenial and have a surface experience of congeniality, but in actuality are like leeches. And that's not shade, it's just observing the conditions. But into differing levels of severity, but just um, initially being very empathetic and agreeable and like getting close to a person, and then like it, negative energy, negative, um, either scapegoating onto a specific demographic of society, um, or some specific element of traditional family life or otherwise, but um, already establishing a rapport and utilizing that rapport, um, just dumping negativity and continuing to um, I don't want to say ego stroke, but basically like continuing to pander or to appease the ego of the man, um, but continually being negative, and drawing out the positive energy, and vitality of a man. And again, it's not blaming anyone, not leeches or anybody else. It's just recognizing what the conditions and the tactics, whether intentional, unintentional, or otherwise. So, point is that when a man is on that spiritual path, and abstains from having the balance of feminine energy, and company and being in that perfect balance, there are increasing susceptibilities and vulnerabilities beyond even the seduction of women. And there are the intentionalities. Like the world system is like, oh, here's one. Employ the. I won't say they employ the drones because it's rather demeaning and disrespectful, but it is that tactic because kinfolk have evidence of being compensated for being thwarters. So that is what is observed. So that's why the challenges of celibacy within the republic imperialist system are increasingly uh, implausible, or at least tenuous, because in and of itself is challenging, like an elephant in must. And even further, um, again, those strengths are utilized as a vulnerability, through seduction from women, as well as through the inundation of commiserating male kinfolk. Um, and it's not meant as hate. It's just communicating articulation, because in some ways the men with the negative energy are actually very sincere and are searching for solution and redemption, and see that within a man who's walking seemingly in a righteous way. And so there's a genuine interest in connecting accordingly. But again, there's often a lack of discipline. There's often a lack of knowledge, and further. And that's not a dig, but because of that. But there's also lots of brilliance and genius, and a lot of established coping mechanisms and unhealthy coping mechanisms, and significant, even superior intellects, and superior knowledge about many other things, and utilizing and a knowledge about how to utilize those things to manipulate and leverage, and additionally. And so these are still being predatory, and the walk of the righteous man is pious. It's not predatory, so it's not skilled in those types of endeavors. It can fend off certain predatory attacks additionally, but eventually it just gets muddy, just like everybody else in that process. So there's benefit of keeping distance from that. And it's difficult to keep distance from that when one physically continues to exist within the city and requires economic trade within the imperialist system. So even whilst being off grid, so that is one of the compounded challenges in tenuousness. Now, the other thing I share is a reminder about a review about how the republic specifically works. There are all different types of imperialism, from monarchic, dictator, and oligarchy, plutocracy, and also the republic, democracy, otherwise. Um, but specifically, the methodology of the republic, just as a review, is that there is a small circle of corrupt men. Um, we can even say sexually corrupt men who collude with each other, who have considerable knowledge about how the game works and collude with each other. It tends to be at least three. Um, and any less, well, it just tends to be three. Then the system that corrupt circle of men, that circle of corrupt men devises and employs, involves the employment of women. I'm not going to say matriarchs, I'm going to say wolves. Um, wolf matriarchs. So the wolf matriarch um, is a woman who is the top gun, and she has a number of men serving her, and uh, the men are able to serve her and maintain certain ego because they are submitting themselves to a feminine authority, and thus having some semblance of or retention of the masculine ego, even though and turning a blind eye to how the wolf matriarch in the republic system is subservient to the small circle of corrupt men. And one of the reasons why turning a blind eye and how that's like somewhat plausible to the men following um, the wolf matriarch, is that the men who are masculine um, recognize that the men who are in the corrupt circle are not masculine, and so there's that valuation like, yeah, they might be doing it, but look at them, da 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 da. Meanwhile, kowtowing to the wolf matriarch, who is kowtowing to the corrupt circle of men. Then either the men in that group either have relations with the wolf matriarch, or have relations with another woman, and begin families, and the men in those families are subservient to the wolf matriarch, um, and that again, that wolf matriarch is subservient to the small circle of corrupt men. And that's the basic framework. The outliers of that methodology are the lone wolf, the woman who abstains from abiding by or being subservient to the small circle of corrupt men, but at the same time, like is availed to the challenges of that as well. Um, so that's the lone wolf. Well, that's the female lone wolf. Then there's the male lone wolf, does similarly, and again, disavails himself to those protections of being in the wolf pack, and under the security and authority of the wolf matriarch. So that's the basics of it. Um, there is the requirement of acculturating children into such a system. It's a difficult system to directly and willfully acculturate children to, because it's very unnatural to the transcendent inclinations of human sentience or humanoid sentience. There's a lot of duplicity in terms of the policies, the public policies that are established by the small circle of men, and the small circle of men employs like facades, so it's not very visible who that small circle of corrupt men are, because there's communication with the wolf matriarch. The wolf matriarch sets up um, actors or kinfolk in positions of authority for that. And so the public looks at those personas rather than the actual small circle of corrupt men. And whenever there's disruptiveness or whatever, then that the presented personas are um, dethroned, and then someone else is in that provides some appeasement towards the public, and then there's continuation. Um, so to look at and again, there's a specific. I mean, talk about 4-year elections and whatever else, but there's a specific um, official protocols that are actually different than the actual protocols. And so, but to continue the actual protocols requires people to actually know those actual protocols and agree to those actual protocols. And that's difficult to do openly because then everybody knows that, and then everybody doesn't do that because that's everybody says, well, why do you do that? Why do you get to do that? Da 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 da, and that undoes itself. But the methodology, the general methodology of acculturation, particularly for children, is corruption. Either being very rich and providing the children with lavish treasures, and then through that saying, okay, if you want to keep getting this, then, and in experiencing treasures, people become delicate, people become soft, people become dependent upon those treasures. And so the threat of taking those treasures away can be very fearful or cause fear. And thus there's a high motivation for complying with whatever transgressions are attached to that ongoing provision of treasures. So that's one methodology of acculturating children into being adults and complicit and involved within the corruption of the system. Um, and that can happen that does happen at different stages of life for ages, for different kinfolk. It happens through threats. It happens through wearing down kinfolk, men endeavoring to be lone wolves and getting fatigued, and eventually simply um, assimilating, acquiescing, and joining up, or anyways. So that's the general methodology of governance within the republic. Um, and again, in that context, um, there is the recognition that the small circle of corrupt men, when observing a lone wolf that is increasingly strong on the spiritual path, again, employing other young wolves, female wolves, to sway the lone wolf into joining the wolf pack, and then employing other young male wolves as the down trotters. What I always say that the like the ones who leeches is a strong word. I'm not trying to be negative and derogatory or even um, uh, subordinating. Um, but it's the ones who drag people down. It's the negative energy kind of young wolves, young male wolves, to attach to a lone wolf and then just wear on the energy of the lone wolf. And that's not blaming. Am I speaking Freudianly? Though I have to keep on saying it. Um, it's just a matter of recognizing the methodologies, the behavior. So, cause and effect. Um, so much of that is already shared. Some of that is putting things together that are shared before in a comparatively new way. It should provide some further insight in putting together for some kinfolk. In actuality, the the world system, but particularly in the United States, isn't the wolf pack. It's hyenas, and that's it's a similar thing. Dog, canine kind of behavior, and that's not a dig on canines because dogs are beautiful. But when human beings um, resemble canines and pretend to be felines or otherwise. That's a different situation. But and particularly that it's the gender implications, because canines, wolves and hyenas specifically, are matriarchic um, uh, beings. And so applying that to the humanoid experience has a certain emasculating um, implication compared to the felines, like the particularly the lions. Tigers tend to be further individual or solitary. But the lions, where it's one male lion having a pride of young lionesses, um, so it's a different dynamic. It's very emasculating. Um, so that's what I mean by being canine-like when feigning to be feline. So there's that. That's pretty much what I have to share at the moment. As much as the world imperialist system seems pervasive, nature is much further pervasive. It's continually present and inviting. It may be easier on some occasions compared to others. It is continually, perennially beautiful, healing, and in attuning ourselves with the rhythms and the wisdom of nature, we are provided with solutions. We are provided with authority, legitimacy, honesty, charisma, because it's healing. Letting go of ego and pride and superiority, and just being in relationship, respect. Letting go of the ambitions of world system, conquering, changing, evolving, even healing the entirety. That's a big weight. Don't necessarily negate that, but don't necessarily endeavor that, or specifically endeavor that either. Just simply being in relationship. Does a tree endeavor to heal the world, heal the universe individually, alone? The tree is rooted in the soil that is the earth and connected with the soil of all the roots of all the other trees. There's communication, there's vibration, there's relation. That's what's up, that's what's down, that's what's all around. Blue sky, reflecting the vibration, absorbing vibration, continuing vibration, allowing vibration from the universe, from the soleil, into the leaves of the trees and the branches and the wind, and absorbing into the xylem and phloem of the branches and the trunk, down to the roots and the vibrations beneath the soil. Nature, the cipher, the miracle, the divine providence, continually unfolding. All thanks and praise to the Most High, and blessed love and peace in Rastafari.